Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this sunny day. I just wanted to let you know that we are aware of the temperature in the room. They are working on the temperature in the room, and hopefully it's going to improve soon. As you know, there is no program that has existed for longer in the Kellogg Institute for International Studies and has been more impactful than the Visiting Fellows program. It is central to the life of the Institute, to our intellectual life on campus, because every year, every semester, we have new ideas, new people, new projects that come to us. So today we are going to have the third and final research spotlight session of this year. We had two previous sessions introducing our Visiting Fellows last semester. And once again, I want to thank Lupe Ramirez and also Risa Sandler and Caitlin for organizing this event. Today, we are going to introduce our new 4 Visiting Fellows that will join us this spring, and also our Dissertation Year Fellowship of this year. Each fellow will speak and introduce their research for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and answers at the end. I know that many viewers are joining us from the comfort of the warmth of their offices and their homes today. So please, if you have any questions for the presenters, feel free to submit those questions by clicking on the button below your viewing windows. Okay. Our first presenter today is Fernando Ojesto. Fernando Ojesto, who is our Fulbright Mexico Studies Chair at the Kellogg Institute this term. He's a professor of law at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, UNAM, and he works on philosophy of law, electoral law, and comparative law. Fernando has served in several roles at the Federal Electoral Tribunal in Mexico, in the United Nations Development Program, and as advisor at the Permanent Mission of Mexico in the UN. Fernando, welcome.
New year. I know that it's very, very cold, but we'll try to warm it a little bit up. I'm going to start. Democracy is not a concession from those in power. Rather, it is a result of social struggles and demands. Democracy is a triumph of the people. Above all, democracy is a collective construction. These ideas will guide my research here at the Kellogg Institute. The title of my research is How to Build and Build a Democracy, the Mexican Case. I will analyze how difficult it is to build a democracy and how easy it is to dismantle it or unbuild it. The path to building a democratic system is long and often challenging. Democracy is not built overnight. It requires a deep and deliberate process to create the necessary foundations for a democratic system. In contrast, the path to dismantling a democracy is much faster, easier, and sometimes even more popular. Power does not like to be constrained, especially when it is gained by majorities. History teaches us that power often seeks to expand itself and at times attempts to destroy anything that limits it, including democracy. Democracy worldwide, particularly in Latin America, is under attack. This research aims to emphasize that democracy is one of the most important victories of the people, but it is also very fragile. The Mexican experience will be the basis of this research, especially because it is a great example of how a democracy was built, but unfortunately, it also serves as an ongoing example of how a democracy can be unbuilt or dismantled. My research will be divided in 2 main sections. The first section will analyze how a democracy is built. It is often said that in electoral matters, it is better to be a historian than a prophet. So this part will be approached from a historical perspective. We will focus on the democratic transition Mexico underwent from 1977 to 2018. This section will outline the necessary and minimum foundations required to build a democracy. From my perspective, an electoral democratic system needs several key elements that cannot be undermined. Political pluralism, meaning that an electoral system requires a competitive and diverse political party system. a body of specialized electoral authorities responsible for organizing and safeguarding democratic conditions during the elections, and a strong legal framework that guarantees political rights to every citizen and ensure fair conditions in elections. The main question this part of research aims to answer are: why did Mexico undergo a democratic transition, analyzing the social and political context? How was the transition achieved, focusing on electoral reforms? And what was built, examining the functioning of democratic institutions. This part of the research will provide a comprehensive overview of how the Mexican democratic system was constructed. For the second part of the research, we will analyze the current state of democracy in Mexico and how a 40-year democratic process has been disrupted over the past 6 years. Since 2018, democracy and its institutions have faced a constant threat orchestrated by the government and its ruling party. This threat, rooted in the concept of political majorities, has escalated into a reality following the 2024 election, where the governing party secured almost complete control, including a supermajority in Congress, granting them the power to amend the Constitution. As of now, power is systematically dismantling the systems of checks and balances that took decades to build that could have terrible consequences in our democratic system. Congress no longer serves as a check on the executive branch, routinely passing bills and constitutional amendments proposed by the president without meaningful discussion. The political party system is neither healthy nor competitive. Autonomous constitutional bodies designed to act as limits to power have been dismantled or are under constant attack, including the electoral authority. And the worst of all, judiciary independence is experiencing one of the gravest threats since our foundation as an independent nation. In a fast-track decision, even before President Sheinbaum took charge, Congress voted the judiciary reform that will change everything. In June 2025, all judges across all levels, including justices of the Supreme Court and electoral justice, will be elected by majority vote. This is seen as a counter-reform referred as the politicization of justice, where popular elections will incentivize judges to decide cases based on public opinion, popularity, and political influence, rather than on the law and established precedents. This, in my view, represents the most dangerous risk to our democracy. Entrusting the judiciary, the very body tasked with limiting power, to the whims of a political majority, undermines the foundational principles of an independent and impartial judiciary, as well as the rule of law. For this part of the research, I will create an institutional record of the key decisions that enable these reforms. It is evident that these institutions pose a challenge to those in power, which is one of the reasons they are now under assault. For my research, it is crucial to recall the ideas of Ferrajoli, who stated, democracy is not simply a matter of majority rule. It is a system of government that requires respect for fundamental rights and guarantee for minorities. Democracy cannot be reduced to the will of the majority. Democratic system must be built on principles of justice, equality, and rule of law, rather than merely reflecting the outcomes of majority decisions. Researching the democratic transition of a country with a long history of anti-democratic practices, but also a significant democratic process, is a way to support and strengthen democracy. As the philosopher George Santayana famously said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This is why we, as scholars, have a commitment to continue studying, discussing, writing, and teaching about democracy, while emphasizing that academic work must have meaningful impact on practitioners. Today, Mexico's democracy is under attack by those in power. My research during my time at Kellogg Institute will aim to analyze and understand this process, as well as highlight the risk it represents to the people's triumph, our democracy. Thank you so much. She's here, or?
We'll have the questions at the end.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Fernando. I'm always surprised of how difficult it is to build an institution and how easy it is to start it. So we really value this research.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Rachel Schwartz, who is Assistant Professor of International and Area Studies at the University of Oklahoma. She works on international anti-corruption commissions, elite manipulation, and democratic backsliding in Central America. Rachel is the author of Undermining the State from Within, The Institutional Legacies of Civil War in Central America, published by Cambridge University Press last year.
Thank you, Aníbal, and thank you all for being here on this very cold day. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to the Kellogg Institute for making this semester possible for me. It's such a privilege. So speaking of building and unbuilding institutions, the project that I'll be working on here at the Kellogg Institute, I think bears some overlap with Fernando's and what he just described. So while here, I'll be working on a book project that's provisionally titled When Impunity Fights Back, International Anti-Corruption Commissions, Elite Manipulation, and Democratic Backsliding in Central America, which tries to make sense of a series of internationally backed anti-corruption initiatives that occurred in Central American countries, particularly Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These took shape in the 2000s, the early 2010s. They were subsequently dismantled between 2019 and 2021. So for this project, I kind of take as my point of departure growing conversations on government corruption, which has really emerged as a leading international policy issue, particularly because of its many adverse effects, especially when it comes to development and security. So there's a strong global policy consensus that governments should and must redouble efforts to fight corruption. Yet I think there's also a growing understanding that they cannot, and in many cases will not, do so on their own. And quite honestly, it's not terribly difficult to understand why, right? Leaving the pursuit of government corruption in the hands of political leaders is essentially asking them to investigate and prosecute themselves and their allies, right? And so because of these challenges of tackling corruption domestically, international organizations have assumed a much more prominent role in the anti-corruption struggle. However, rather than imposing what are very costly top-down solutions, this international involvement has taken much more of a hybrid form through what I call in the project International Anti-Corruption Commissions, or IACCs. These are bodies in which international experts partner with domestic personnel to investigate and prosecute corruption, as well as introduce important institutional reforms. So IACCs reflect what a lot of scholars within international relations have called shared sovereignty arrangements, right? There's international involvement, but national authorities have substantial control over the scope and the reach of what are essentially joint ventures here. So for a corrupt government, this kind of a hybrid commission might actually be pretty appealing, right? It allows them to signal, to essentially feign a commitment to global anti-corruption norms on the one hand, while also manipulating and controlling anti-corruption enforcement. And so the book project I'll be working on here focuses on the part of the world where these IACCs were pioneered, Central America, and examines the development and consequences of them. And specifically, the project asks 3 questions. So first, why are international anti-corruption commissions vested with different levels of independence? In other words, what explains their institutional design? 2, why in some contexts do political and economic elites more successfully push back against them and neutralize their effects? And then finally, what do these international anti-corruption commissions mean for democracy? How do they affect democratic institutions in the long run? And so I address these questions by comparing and examining 3 IACC experiences in Central America. So the United Nations sponsored International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which is known as CC. I also look at the Organization of American States-backed mission to support the fight against corruption and impunity in Honduras, which was known as MAXI. And then finally, I look at the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, which was known as CCS, which was also sponsored by the OAS. And so beyond sort of unpacking the lessons and the legacies of Central America's anti-corruption struggles, my hope is that this project will also inform broader policy debates on the possibilities and the limitations of international support to fight corruption domestically. And so I just wanted to sort of close by sharing some of the preliminary findings and insights that are very much in progress when it comes to these different questions related to IACCs. So first, in thinking about the design of IACCs, the degree of autonomy that they have to investigate and prosecute corruption, I posit that it's not just that these are the product of government and international organization negotiations, but it's also about domestic conflict and contestation as well. So for example, in Guatemala, we see the commission that had the highest degree of operational independence, the CICIG. And I argue that this had a lot to do with a robust civil society-led coalition that leveraged ties with IO and government insiders and was able to lobby for a highly independent commission. Second, I argue that while this kind of domestic distributive conflict is a really important part of the story, it's also important to recognize that IACC development doesn't occur in a vacuum. There's a really important transnational dimension of this story as well. So just as international policymakers learn from the successes and the failures of previous interventions, so too do domestic politicians learn from previous anti-corruption experiences in neighboring countries, and they recalibrate their strategies for how to rein in anti-corruption enforcement. And so we see this quite clearly, for example, in how Honduran leaders under the government of President Juan Orlando Hernandez devised a much weaker, much more diffuse International Anti-Corruption Commission in the wake of, and by looking at Guatemala's CICIG, we also see this in how Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele crafted a commission that was completely subordinate to the executive in response to the anti-corruption gains in Guatemala and Honduras, right? So there's a kind of political learning story here as well. And then finally, international anti-corruption commissions, unfortunately, can have perverse unintended consequences for democracy by spurring elite backlash that can end up appropriating and weaponizing these internationally backed legal innovations to then criminalize dissent. And we see this very clearly in the context of Guatemala in the post-CICIG period, which has coincided with quite swift democratic erosion. So I think it's this piece is really important when it comes to the implications for how we understand the relationship between state strengthening and rule of law strengthening and democracy building in these fragile contexts. So there's been quite a lot of scholarship on the need to strengthen state institutions before deepening democracy in conflict-ridden countries where governance remains quite weak. But I think this project shows that these institutional islands of excellence that get created through commissions like what we saw in Guatemala, the CICIG, they remain extremely vulnerable absent broader political reforms. So I'm going to leave things here, but thank you very much, and I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you, Brent. I find it fascinating, this idea of reverse diffusion, that
Yes.
success in the early stages can make success less likely in the later phase. Our third presenter today is Edgar Taylor, who is a lecturer in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. His research examines urban protest and racial politics in 20th century Uganda. He has published articles in the Journal of Eastern African Studies, History in Africa, Comparative Studies in Society and History, and other important venues. He will discuss his research on infrastructures of exclusion in urban Uganda from 1945 to 1972. Edgar, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here as a visiting fellow in the Kellogg Institute. My name is Edgar Taylor. I come from a different disciplinary background. I'm a historian from Makerere University in Kampala, which means that I'm very cold right now. But my work primarily looks at the fate of racial minorities in the relationship between populist politics and public institutions in the East African country of Uganda in the 1950s and 1960s. It does so for two broader reasons. First, to recover the sense of possibility in the multiple competing aspirations of anti-colonial politics. And the second purpose of my work is to understand how activists inhabited changing media and urban infrastructures to give form to racial populism. The tension between this sense of possibility on one hand and the closing of political space on the other is really at the heart of many populist movements. And for Ugandans who experienced the end of British colonial rule in 1962, the 1950s and 1960s were decades of enormous optimism and innovation. British officials noted with concern that Ugandans seemed to have, quote, a reverence for elections, and they concluded that the only hope of prolonging British influence was, quote, to vary the conception of what democracy meant to Africans. Of course, Ugandans had many different conceptions of democracy and justice. For example, the Democratic Party, which won Uganda's first free elections in 1961, advocated for Christian democracy informed by Catholic principles of fairness. However, other activists also worked to close down public political space. In 1959, a bombastic young political entrepreneur named Augustine Kamya organized a social and economic boycott of Indian traders who dominated Uganda's retail and wholesale commerce. His supporters wanted to end British colonialism, but they wanted it to include the elevation of unelected traditional monarchies and the empowerment of Africans as a racial group to accumulate individual wealth in urban commerce. To do this, they used threats and violence to enforce an economic boycott of Indian-owned shops and to suppress voting in national elections. And I argue that one of the interesting aspects of their activism was that it co-opted deep historical conversations over what was just authority and reciprocal obligation between elites and commoners, anchored in the Luganda language concept of edembe, which might be best translated as freedom through social stability. In reality, their actions largely benefited an existing economic and political elite in Buganda Kingdom, while foreclosing the democratic vision of other activists. The book that I'm writing as a fellow here, which is tentatively titled Infrastructures of Exclusion, Authority, and Everyday Politics in Urban Uganda, 1945 to 1972. In it, I'm writing that attempts to explain the complexities and multiple historical genealogies of racial populism in this particular time and place. The book argues that what is often referred to in Uganda simply as just anti-Indian politics was not a monolithic movement, but was contingent on historically meaningful political languages and changing infrastructures after World War II. I focus on 6 domains of public life where Indians became a subject of political contestation in Uganda: Indian community meetings, African political rallies, struggles between supposedly official and pirate media, including photography and print, commercial interactions over shop counters, legal contestations, and finally, newspaper debates over interracial intimacy. Sifting through newly released government archives, vernacular historical newspapers, oral histories and memoirs, the picture that emerges is not of a clash between mutually exclusive racial populism on one hand and liberal pluralism on the other, or between democratic and authoritarian ideologies. Rather, we can see how particular forms of communication afforded activists the ability to dig into a deep historical intellectual toolkit in pursuit of diverse and changing aims. This historical approach, I think, helps not only to explain the endurance of race in Uganda's political life, but also to see the contingencies of exclusionary populism and the potential for inclusive democratic norms in response to racialized inequality and colonial violence. Excuse me. So as some may know, in 1972, the military dictator Idi Amin expelled all but a few hundred of Uganda's Indian population, including revoking the citizenship of thousands of Ugandan citizens. Today, many Ugandans express nostalgia for Amin's economic racial nationalism, particularly critics of Uganda's current president, who has presided over economic liberalization and widening inequality during his nearly 4 decades in power. Others, such as the historian Samweri Lwanga Lanigo, supportively recycle Idi Amin's association between decolonization, authoritarianism, and racial exclusion. To many other Ugandans, I should say, these popular celebrations of despotic leadership and the denigration of non-racial citizenship are causes of despair and grave concern. But I think speaking today from the United States, the day after the inauguration of an openly anti-democratic president, it's important to remember the complex material and conceptual motivations that make such leadership popular to so many. In the histories behind these motivations that sustain populist closing of political space, we may not only find the supposed root causes of what is, but we might also recover inclusive democratic ideas of what we might become. Thank you.
We look forward to this one. Our next presenter is Eduardo Febres, who is our Dissertation Year Fellow this year. Eduardo is a PhD candidate in Spanish at the Department of Romance Languages at the University of Notre Dame. He received an MA in journalism from Universidad Torcuato Di Tello in Argentina in 2011, and a BA in literature from Universidad Central de Venezuela in 2006. Eduardo, welcome.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Kellogg Institute for supporting my research and having me here today. As you may know, the word Venezuela has been heard often in the 21st century during election campaigns. And in this context, some Venezuelans have claimed in social media, sorry, I come from the future, to warn about dangers of electing candidates leaning left or even center. I study a Venezuelan who comes from the past to warn about our future. Specifically about the dangers of building a public sphere in which the elite talks to itself while becomes unable to hear the claims of the multitude. He was concerned about these matters in the first half of the 19th century, that is after the independence wars. And he showed how the intellectual elite was overestimating the cohesive power of the printing press. And even more, they imagined, designed, and established republics that were systematically turning their backs on the racialized populations that made the independence possible. So I look at Rodriguez's sociopolitical essays and typographic experiments against the grain of what I found in global and national archives regarding the scarce evidence that there is available of communicative and pedagogic devices used by racialized populations before, during, and after the independence war. I also read his work against the grain of the elitist print culture against whose his project was, even though he was part of this culture. On the first chapter, I read the Hispanic American racial capitalism through Rodriguez's critique, specifically on how this project relied on the systematic exclusion of the racialized multitude from the public sphere, both as a subject of discussion and as participants of it. He said, the Indians and the Black people will not always work to barely satisfy their meager needs while excessively fulfilling the many needs of their masters. And he also showed how the neglected multitude was the avant-garde of the language modernization of which the Hispanic American intellectual elite was so proud. In the second chapter, I examine evidence of communicative and pedagogic devices and techniques used by people from African and indigenous descent in the continental Caribbean and in the Andean region. And I read them against the grain of Rodrigo's technical innovations regarding pedagogy and communication. He had the same concern that the rest of the intellectual elite, which was the rise of a multi-ethnical and multicultural mass. But unlike them, what he proposed was to embrace heterogeneity and the internal tensions instead of the homogeneous solutions of the very well-known mestizaje. In the third chapter, I show how Rodriguez did incorporate Andean practices and concepts in his critique of racial capitalism. His project was informed by strategies that women from the Incanate used to resist the acculturation practices of the Spanish Empire. And he sheds light into how reproductive labor was both a core component of the colonial economy and must be like a change in the reproductive labor relations had to be a core part of any alternative to racial capitalism. Whereas later, let's call them counter-hegemonic narratives such as Latin American Marxism took reproductive labor for granted. He foregrounded it. He proposed to add domestic labor to the payroll. He proposed to add non-married women to public life, etc. In my fourth chapter, I show how Rodriguez did use a dual strategy to inoculate Latin American print culture. On the one hand, he produced these very rare print objects, hard to find, hard to read, and even harder to implement. But on the other hand, he used a repertoire of body techniques on which he reflected on his essays to stir emotions among influential writers. The most known of all, Simón Bolívar, who was like to whom Rodriguez was a mentor, and he called Rodriguez a pilot of all his military and political glories. Thus, with the fame granted by these personal relations that he established with some influential writers, he managed to reach the public that his work was aiming to, which was the people in the centuries to come in the Americas. Summarizing, I looked at the print objects of this relatively well-known but understudied author to propose an alternative perspective on the challenges that the increasing distance between the educated public sphere and the illiterate or uneducated masses are posing to democracy and governance in Venezuela, but also in the Americas and beyond.
Thank you, Eduardo. And our last presenter today is Rebecca Hanson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law, as well as at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. Her research focuses on policing, armed violence, and illicit market in the Global South. And she's the co-author of Harassed, Gender, Bodies, and Ethnographic Research, and the co-editor with two of our former visiting fellows of The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime, and Policing During Chavismo.
So I was rushing to get back here from Chicago, and I'm usually like a very fast speaker. So I'm gonna try and slow down a little bit. I've been like rushing around all morning, so I apologize in advance if this is a little bit messy. But this works out actually quite well because I think I was supposed to go first. And so now we're kind of moving from Venezuela in the past to Venezuela now, which is the case that I'm looking at. So I'm working on this project with Fernando, who's a former fellow here as well. And the project is really trying to think about how to connect a largely understudied and really overlooked aspect of how authoritarian governments remain in power, how they survive, and how they consolidate their power. Really kind of focusing on 21st century cases. In this case, the case of the government of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. So a lot of the scholarship in the past that has particularly focused on the 20th century authoritarian consolidation and survival has really kind of tended to think about or focus on things like state security forces or a very consolidated state apparatus or like a very unified government, right? To kind of try to understand why certain authoritarian regimes are actually able to survive a lot of challenges to their power. And what we're kind of trying to think about is this former scholarship on authoritarianism and putting it into conversation with current cases where we know that in places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Syria, authoritarian governments have not only relied on state security forces, right, but also have outsourced coercion and repression to non-state armed groups and to criminal groups, right? And so we're really kind of trying to take this more classic body of scholarship on authoritarianism and put it into conversation with this more recent scholarship on criminal governance, which has come out of the work, of course, of Benjamin Lessing, Desmond Arias, Beatrice Magaloni, and others, right? Really kind of recognizing the fact that in a lot of places of the global south, it's not states or governments that govern populations or control territory, right? But instead are actually criminal groups in a lot of places in Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Nicaragua that are actually governing territories and populations. So we're kind of trying to think about how do we understand authoritarian consolidation in places where what's actually happening is a decentralization of coercion and a pluralization of violent actors. So this is very distinct to, again, this kind of focus on centralization that was really kind of highlighted in 20th century authoritarian contexts. So one of the things that we see as novel about this project is that the concept of criminal governance has really come out of this broader conversation about how transitions away from authoritarianism towards democracy actually facilitates criminal governance, right? So kind of trying to think about how moves away from authoritarianism, transitions towards democracy can result in the pluralization of violent actors and violent actors that control territory the governments and states have not been able to control or have not been able to penetrate. So what we're kind of trying to say is this is a useful concept for understanding transitions from democracy, from authoritarianism to democracy, but also probably from democracy to authoritarianism, right? And probably really can't understand how authoritarian governments in the 21st century remain in power without thinking about the simultaneous move of centralizing certain types of power and decentralizing coercive power. So we're focusing on the relationships between, we're taking what we refer to as like a relational ethnographic approach to authoritarian coercion in Venezuela. So we're focusing on the relationships between the government of Nicolás Maduro and three different armed groups. One, the police, armed state security force, armed community organizations that are slowly becoming kind of parastate policing groups that have ideological affinities and alliances with the government of Nicolás Maduro, and relationships between the government and gangs in certain parts of the country, where the government has basically constructed pacts with these gangs saying, you know, we'll kind of remove ourselves and the police from your territory as long as you kind of maintain calm in the streets, and in some cases get people out to vote. So again, really kind of trying to think about how non-state groups that the government actually has very little control over and has quite volatile relationships with can result in authoritarian consolidation. So really kind of trying to think about how in some ways authoritarian consolidation relies on the consolidation of criminal governance in certain places. And so the goal here is to really kind of try to update our ideas about what authoritarian survival and consolidation looks like in the 21st century, taking into account that the landscape of coercion and policing and security looks much different now than it did in the 20th century. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very So you can see why we are so excited about our visiting fellows this semester and the work they are doing and the projects that we will be discussing. I want to invite all of you who are interested in these topics to contact them, to work with them, to learn more about their projects throughout the semester. But now we have comfortably half an hour or more for questions and answers. So I would like to open the floor for any conversation. Mark.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you here. I have many questions, but maybe just a few at the beginning. Maybe first for Fernando. I was really convinced by your remarks on Mexico and why we should be concerned about the upcoming reforms. But I think one challenge always is, especially when it comes to the rule of law, how do we make the case to ordinary citizens, why we should care about the rule of law, why it's actually important to have an independent judiciary and not to vote for it, right? Because when we ask citizens, they will tell us, well, democracy is all about electing people. And so why, in this case, would it be actually a problem or an issue for democracy to have this reform implemented? I would just love to hear your thoughts. I mean, maybe then just a second question for Rachel. I'm really interested in this approach to have independent commissions investigate cases of corruption and so on. I was thinking maybe this serve as a broader framework that you're offering for how to counter bad governance, how to counter maybe other forms of backsliding, including executive actions towards the judiciary or maybe other actors that are important to keep the executive in check. So maybe you can share a couple of thoughts on what we can maybe learn more broadly about how to counter trends of democratic decay. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And I think that it is very important to discuss why this is important for citizens, for ordinary citizens, that judiciary reform. I want to remind people that judges don't represent people. They don't need to represent people's will. They don't need to represent a political majority. Judges represent law, the Constitution, and their decisions need to be based on precedents, judiciary precedents, and the law. That's the rule of law. So you don't want a judge to decide a case, a family case regarding a divorce and kids and with a political view. You want to resolve the judge solve this problem with based in the law and in judiciary precedents. So I think that this is very important because people think that democracy. Some people think that democracy is only about elections, about that it's probably more democratic to elect judges than to have a judicial career that you don't even know how they are designated. But I think that the main problem is that view is very it's a high risk for our rule of law, because probably judges will try now to be very popular because they are going to be elected and then they need to have a re-election. People will also have the power to take them down. So if they have, for example, in these cases that are probably that have a lot of discussion, like abortion cases, a judge, if he is a judge in a conservative state, he will not judge in favor of a woman because he will need to go to the polls next year. So I think that is the risk, the main risk for the ordinary citizens for this, I call it counter reform, because it will diminish in judiciary independence. Thank you for your question.
Great. Thanks, Mark, so much for the question. So I think you're absolutely right that these international anti-corruption commissions that I'm looking at are a case of something bigger, right? They're a case of what I think of as shared sovereignty or hybrid good governance type interventions, right? And they provide a lot of advantages, both from the perspective of the international community as well as from the perspective of domestic leaders, right? By having an entity that is in part owned and operated by domestic authorities, It's a lot less costly for the international community. It doesn't have the sort of, it's not tainted by claims that this is a form of international imposition, right? There's a sense of domestic legitimacy that it offers. But at the same time, with international backing, it provides some distance from the political system that is thought to be the agent compromising or undermining or just distorting anti-corruption efforts nationally, right? So there's a lot that's appealing about this and this model of improving governance in poorly governed countries, right? But I think what I'm also learning is that there are some potentially thorny unintended consequences here as well, right? Especially when it comes to democracy and institutional independence. And I'll just give you one example, right? So in the case of Guatemala's UN-backed International Commission Against Impunity, which was known as the CICIG, this was a highly effective commission that ends up sort of at its peak in 2015, uncovering a whole range of high-profile corruption scandals. It ends up bringing down the sitting president and vice president who are ousted and thrown behind bars, right? In the wake of that, there is severe elite backlash to this commission, as one can imagine. Part of that backlash is targeted at the sitting attorney general, a woman by the name of Delma Dana, who is currently in Washington, D.C. in exile, just to show you sort of where this story goes. And in order to insulate and protect her, the Guatemalan legislature passes a law that basically sets the bar extremely high for dismissing the attorney general, right? And this is meant to shield her from these political attacks. So basically, she has to commit and be convicted of a crime in order to be removed from office legally. Now, today, that very law is in place and is keeping in office another attorney general by the name of Consuelo Porras, who has been sanctioned by the United States government for abetting corruption and undermining democracy in Guatemala, and who has been sort of at the helm of this lawfare campaign to criminalize political opponents, right? And so I think it's a cautionary tale, right, in some ways, of how these sort of, referring to the terms used by Ezequiel González Ocantos and co-author's book, these kinds of anti-corruption crusades that empower this kind of prosecutorial zeal can have these perverse consequences as well. So I think there's two sides to the coin here when it comes to the takeaways for democracy.
Excellent. Thank you so much for my fellows. I'm Nermeen and I'm a fellow at the Kellogg Institute. My first question is for Fernando's amazing project, and I'm really interested in learning more about what data you'll be using in the project and kind of like the status of the archival resources in Mexico. It's a selfish question because I do work on the Middle East, and usually the status of archival work is very poor. So I'm looking for insight from you on how to access these kind of data. Rachel, loved your project. I really love it. And my question is similar to Mark's, and I think you did touch upon it. But I love how you're talking about the transnational political learning when it comes to the regimes learning from each other on how to construct these committees to deem them kind of like useless, right? Very weak. But what I'm interested in is what are the kind of transnational political learning that are happening at the level of movements to make such committees actually useful and beneficial for democratic consolidation rather than erosion. Eduardo's, I've attended your research before, your research presentation before, and I love how your project is evolving. And I really would love to hear you more expand on the role of reproductive labor of women in the capitalist economy, and honestly, how and whether these thoughts, did it infiltrate mainstream critique of market economy, or it did not? My sense that it didn't, but I would love to hear more about this idea of the role of reproductive labor of women in capitalist economy, the critique of it. And Edgar and Rebecca, I cannot wait to hear more about your research, and I really, really appreciate, Rebecca, how you're inviting us to, yes, to update the literature on authoritarian consolidation and what and who we consider actors in authoritarian consolidation. So fascinating work, and I cannot wait to hear more about it and learn more about your research.
Thank you so much. So what I'm trying to do is to have a institutional record of the principal decisions of these institutions that are under attack that help build this narrative against them. So, for example, the electoral authority, that is called the National Electoral Institute, they decided a case to cancel the registration of a candidate because he didn't present any financial data. But this candidate was part of the governing party. So the governing party used this decision of the Electoral Institute to attack it. So these decisions that probably they were based on the law, and I think that they were, I don't know if democratic, but they were very well fundamented. They helped the narrative of the government to start attack to these institutions. Also the judiciary power, especially the Supreme Court, they have several decisions that they declared unconstitutional some law that they were some bills that they were very important for the president in that time. So they were the president used these decisions in order to attack the Supreme Court because the narrative is that people want those reforms and how 11 judges will be against majorities. No, so I'm gonna track these decisions. I don't know if they are some key elements of why are we at this stage. Why the Supreme Court right now, we're gonna all the justices, they are removed and we're gonna elect new justices. We're gonna, so why is this? I think that this data will be also important. And of course the index, I like to use the World Justice Project in the Index of Rule of Law, and World Justice Project have a special index in Mexico. And the last years, we've been how the rule of law have been in diminishing, and that's very important. And the lecture that we had last week about how to measure democracy, it's very important because last week I read an article that says that democracy is healthier in Mexico because more people supports democracy. But what is democracy? No, so it's also a question. That's why I say that it's very important to remember Ferraiolis, that democracy is not only about majorities. No, so I'll try to track all these decisions that democratic institutions made in order to be at this stage of on building a democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nermeen, for the terrific question. And you're 100% right that political learning is not only occurring at the sort of internet level of international policy, the level of sort of regional, sort of domestic political leaders, it's also occurring at the level of movements. And so what we end up seeing in these Central American cases, Guatemala is the first that establishes this International Anti-Corruption Commission. In 2015, it ends up ousting the president and vice president. It just so happens that in Honduras, less than a year later, there's a major corruption scandal that is unveiled in which the sitting government of Juan Orlando Hernández is found to have siphoned off over $350 million from the Honduran Institute of Social Security. And some of that was funneled directly into his re-election campaign. And so people take to the streets. There's a movement that's called the Indignados that emerges. They go out at night, they have torches, they are, marching in the streets. And what is their main demand? We want a CC. So not a CC with a G for Guatemala, a CC with an H for Honduras, right? And so that only becomes thinkable because of the Guatemalan example. Now, what does the Honduran regime do in response? Well, they decide not to go with the United Nations, which is a stronger international organization. They go with the OAS, which is weaker, which is also much more sort of politically pliable. So I was in Honduras this past summer doing field research, and one of the things that I heard over and over and over again was that this deal between the OAS and Honduras was essentially Honduras conditioning their vote for the Secretary General of the OAS's reelection bid subsequently, right? And so that's one of the things that the regime learns. They also create a anti-corruption commission with a much more diffuse mandate that takes the focus off of criminal investigation and prosecution and moves it into areas such as vetting judges and police reform, which are all very good things, right? But it's meant to water down the prosecutorial piece. So this learning and what the project I hope is going to do is kind of track this sort of the bouncing between these different levels and this broader process of.
Thank you so much for your question. Well, first I have to say that Rodriguez is a sort of off-brand materialist. Like he was writing at the same time as Marx and Engels, and he had very similar intuitions, but he was looking at a different world. But as Marx and Engels, he thought more about the problems of racial capitalism than about the solution. However, there are a couple of things that I would highlight regarding the labor. One, he referred to proletarians appealing to the etymology, like people that is considered only good to make child. On the other hand, when he states what are like the competitive advantages or the revolutionary possibility in Hispanic America, he says, well, the English had the aristocrats, the French had the bourgeoisie, and he said that in Hispanic America we had the cryptogamous, which is like an obsolete botanical category to talk about those kind of beings that we don't know how they reproduce themselves. So he was very concerned of how like those are two, I'm stating separate facts because like the whole thing is in the chapter. And the third thing is that when he said what his project would look like, his version of the commune, one of the things he proposed is something that then like the campaign for waging the domestic labor came up with in the 1970s, was to wage the domestic labor as part of the new reality that he wanted to control. And this has had to do also with the fact that reproductive labor in Hispanic America, and especially in the Andes, was not only not recognized, but beyond that, because of the racialization, they weren't even recognized as domestic labor. I don't know if this makes sense. Like in Europe, like the kind of oppression that domestic labor experienced was within the margins of a recognized citizenship. Whereas in Hispanic America, there was like this double oppression, which meant like, okay, so you do free labor as a woman, but you also are not recognized as a wife, a citizen, a person. So I think these concerns build a critique more clearly that like the critique than what was the way out of it, except for the intuition that domestic labor had to be waged, which coming from the 19th century is very premature.
I have in my list Sandra and Mayra. Sandra.
Thank you all for the presentations. Two quick questions. The first one is for Rachel. I'm wondering if in the work that you're doing, do you think the composition, or how, if you can speak briefly to how maybe the composition of these commissions has any influence in their legacy? If you talk about the tension between and how convenient it is that they are international, because of course you want them slightly removed from but they also have domestic components, so that's really great. And because the CICIG is the foundational one, and it was headed by Velázquez, like very famous Colombian guy. So how do the others compare to that? What was the role of, are you thinking about composition and how it might influence? And then I had a question for Rebecca. I'm wondering if you can speak briefly about the transnational dimension of these groups that you're studying, right? Both in how you see or what challenges their transnational dimension poses, if it's an advantage, both because Venezuela is an exporter through the Tren de Aragua, but also because from Colombia and from other places, like there's all these influences coming into Venezuela as well. So if you can tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandra, for the question. I will say that, so Iván Velázquez, the current Minister of Defense of Colombia, was the CICIG's last commissioner. He was there for the longest, and he is by far the most beloved of the three commissioners of the CICIG. The first was a Spanish jurist named Carlos Castellana, who's very controversial. The second was a former Costa Rican prosecutor named Francisco de Alenese, who was also quite controversial and seen as not really having done much. And sort of Velázquez is seen as the crusader that came in. He developed the best working relationship with his counterpart, the Attorney General, and they really undertook the most ambitious anti-corruption campaign that sort of departed from the previous attempts within the CICIG by actually taking a much more sort of macro criminal focus. It wasn't just, we're going to go after one high-profile former president for embezzlement. No, we're going to kind of untangle this broader web. In terms of the question of composition, though, so yes, when I'm thinking about the autonomy of these institutions, composition is crucial here because we have a range. The CICIG is essentially given a mandate in which international personnel can participate fully in the investigation of corruption and in the judicialization of cases in national courts. This is unprecedented, right? What happens with the MAXI then, and so the other piece of this is that as the kind of partner agency or task force, so to speak, within the Ministerio Público, the Public Prosecutor's Office, is a unit that becomes known as the FESI, the Fiscalía Especial contra la impunidad. So this is the specialized task force that in reality has a tremendous amount of autonomy, does not have to go to the Attorney General to vet cases, for example, before investigating them. So what does Honduras's commission do in response to this? Well, it just so happens that international personnel cannot select cases, cannot investigate directly, cannot prosecute them in courts. But within the MAXI's mandate, there is this sort of line about colaboración activa. And this gets interpreted by MAXI authorities as saying, no, international personnel can be a part of these investigations. They just can't essentially litigate cases in court, right? Then we get to Honduras, or sorry, El Salvador, the CCS. And what does Bukele learn from the CICIG and the MAXI experiments? Well, he learns that these commissions should be completely tied to the presidency, to the executive, and that they should only be given a technical assistance advisory role. They can't investigate, they can't prosecute. They're meant to propose reforms just to the executive, right? When the CCS is created, there's no accord between it and the Attorney General's office, for example. And so this element of both, I think, composition, but also mandate, right? And what international personnel can and cannot do has a tremendous effect on how these commissions operate.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, I mean, When this question gets asked a lot, whenever you talk about crime and violence in Venezuela, I always like to start by saying I'm highly skeptical of most of the information that has been put out about the Tren de Aragua in outside of Venezuela. I think there's not very great information about that group within Venezuela, and then outside of it, I'm concerned that most of the information that we have about this group is based off of groups that have an interest in amplifying and exaggerating its transnational components. So I think police departments here and in Latin America, you get more resources and more attention if you talk about there being a transnational presence, particularly this very scary presence of the Tren de Aragua in your territory. I think that members who there's, I think, the little bit of data that we have on this, I think more so indicates that gang members also migrate. And when they migrate, they set up shop in other places. And that's very different from like a transnational presence that usually the Tren de Aragua is presented as. So there are, these very like elaborate, like exaggerated claims about them being like the new Maras, which is very crazy given that the Maras had like 30 years to, organize. So I always like to start by saying, I just don't think we have enough information to really make very secure claims about the Tren de Aragua. And my thought is that I think it seems very clear that there's an active and collaborative presence between Venezuela and Colombia. I think in Chile and Peru, it's more likely the case that these are kind of just like offshoots. It's not necessarily collaborate, not a strong collaboration, probably more so like these small groups. You wouldn't even necessarily need to be a member of the Tren de Aragua to show up somewhere and think like, what's the best way to get some gang capital, to get some masculine capital here is to say that I was a member when I was in Venezuela. So I think it's very difficult at this point to be able to say what all we know about the group. I really worry about how much like information that seems very accurate and concrete is being published on the group, because I think it then obviously, I think, as we probably all know here, then gets used to talk about deporting Venezuelans from the United States or any other countries, or justifying like these really strict bans on Venezuelans. In terms of thinking about how that matters for the domestic context, and this is something that like we're thinking about a lot with this project, is that it's very impressive that the government of Maduro has been able to survive as long as it has and consolidate, given how incredibly fragmented armed actor relationships are still on the ground. And I think that's even true for the Tren de Aragua. So I guess like I would just wrap up by saying, I think we have to be really, really skeptical about claims that are being made about that group for a really long time until we have some actually good data that's not based off police accounts and very poorly investigated journalist accounts. Because I think until we have that information, we end up making very incorrect and problematic claims about, Sorry.
So if I could just add, was not meaning to suggest.
Oh, yeah.
That the breaking that.
No, yes, absolutely.
Like, no, right,
Yeah.
I was asking more about the stuff that we know is happening in Colombia or.
Yeah.
It's more.
Yeah, and I think, I absolutely think that there has been, I was doing fieldwork in Peru this summer. I absolutely think there has been some reconfiguration of, I think that's probably is more kind of the more salient aspect, is less about kind of the transnational aspect and more about the importation of certain like criminal practices, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to indicate that. It's just something, it's a very like sensitive issue, like within Venezuela, like,
I have Mayra, Rashid, and Kelly. Why don't we take Mayra and Rashid's questions? So we're coming close to the time, and then we can have a round of answers, and then we go to Kelly. Mayra?
Yeah, I have a question for Rachel and for Rebecca. I was wondering, so maybe this is, it was first than the other ones, but I was wondering how much the CICIG was supposed to be about corruption. Because they talk in the mandate about the like clandestine and illegal corps and whatever. And also, since you were talking about like the 3 commissioners, like I've heard that they had like different prosecutorial objectives, like. So, and Iván Velázquez was like very clearly into that type of cases, right? Like high corruption or whatever.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, and then like the two other ones were very clearly about corruption because of what happened in Venezuela. So in Venezuela, sorry, in Guatemala. But I was wondering, like, yeah, like how the CICIG interpreted corruption, maybe if that's something that is important, like in the story. And to Rebecca, my question sounds fascinating, but I was wondering, like, how are you going about the collection of data, considering that you were like investigating like very difficult actors? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do have a question for Rebecca and Edgar. So I'm just wondering for Rebecca, what is the rationale for the state to, the authoritarian regime? We do know that authoritarian regimes prefer to keep their circles tight. The more people you have, the more you increase in the chance that somebody might come up and sort of challenge you, or so you always want to keep your inner circle tight, and even then you don't even trust the inner circle, right? And so is this a story of state capacity, or is it that they do not have the capacity, but so they would rather outsource to these actors? But if that is the case, how do they make sure that they also keep these actors in check? You don't want them to think that they're too strong and start feeling like they could, challenge you. And so I wonder, what is the story here? What is the rationale for the state? If you're an authoritarian regime, what is your thinking doing so? But I don't know if I have a very solid question yet, but I think that it's just really interesting because so the story, what I'm more familiar with is the Kenyan case, right? And in Kenya too, you have a similar evolution of the Indian population growing, and there were a lot of Indians who came through. I think it was the Kenya-Uganda project. And so, but I just wonder, why did it evolve differently in the Kenyan case, or somewhat differently? I think in Kenya today it's more, I think there were still some contentions and racial issues at some point, but arguably the results, the outcome were different. And you could say maybe it's Idi Amin, but I wonder if there's some other factors that explain the differences that we would observe, in the Kenyan case compared to the Ugandan case. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Maida, for the question. You're absolutely right that the CICIG's genesis gives it a kind of odd idiosyncratic mandate, at least on paper. So the CICIG emerges out of the sort of Guatemalan post-war moment, and in particular, the sort of domestic and international recognition that we have what ends up getting called in Spanish, cuerpos ilegales y aparatos clandestinos de seguridad, which is a total mouthful, but it basically is meant to signal these counterinsurgent, illicit security structures of ex-military officials who are continuing to engage in human rights abuses and corruption, right? So the CICIG's mandate is to investigate them and their sort of linkages within the state apparatus, to prosecute them and to initiate institutional reforms to ensure that they don't exist and operate and the rule of law is enforced, right? And so I think you're absolutely right that this gets interpreted in different ways and different moments, and perhaps Iván Velázquez's unique experience sort of with the parapolitica and other sort of cases sort of shapes his macro criminal focus, which takes on much more force during his tenure as commissioner. But what another piece of this that I think is interesting in the case of the CICIG and that is makes Guatemala quite distinct from Honduras and El Salvador is that one of the reasons why I think the CICIG doesn't end up getting as much pushback until Velázquez's tenure is because the political system in Guatemala is so fragmented that I think what my sense is that political and economic elites see that they can use the CICIG to go after one another. They're sort of rivals, right? And so we see this happen, for example, under the tenure of the first commissioner, Carlos Castresana, in which he's more seen as more allied with the sort of traditional elite, the traditional oligarchic class in Guatemala. What is his sort of big landmark case? It's against former Guatemalan President Alfonso Portillo, who's kind of like the emblem of the emerging elite in Guatemala, right? Then under the next commissioner, we see a case against a conservative businessman who's Minister of the Interior. In that case is involving extrajudicial executions in the prison system, right? And so this is a win for the emerging elite against the traditional oligarchy. And so there's this kind of competition and these rivalries that end up sort of getting played out through the CICIG until Velázquez comes along and says, no, we're going after all of you, essentially. Right. So I think that's another important piece of the story. I do think you're right that I think one of the things that ultimately convinces the Guatemalan government to get on board with the CICIG, other than sort of consistent civil society pressures, is that it's billed much more as a sort of organized crime fighting body. But even I think within its mandate, right, there's a recognition that organized crime feeds on the state and on these corrupt exchanges, right? But there is some variation in how that gets interpreted.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's one simple answer about differences between Uganda and Kenya, and then a more complicated answer about why they're in fact so similar. The difference is mainly settler colonialism. There's a large white settler population in Kenya. It means that there are Indians in Kenya who are like Piogama Pinto, who are very involved in nationalist politics, form alliances with African politicians, and also that there are more Asians have in Kenya were situated politically in a more complicated space than in Uganda, where there were the only British there were administrators. But after independence, there's actually a lot of similarities in the way that the states operate and popular reactions to state intervention. So Uganda implements trade licensing and immigration acts targeting low-level Indian traders at the same time that Kenya and Tanzania do the exact same thing. Much of the literature about Idi Amin's expulsion of Indians from Uganda is actually just fiction of colonialism. The British effectively expel their citizens from Britain. These majority are British citizens. They're forced to apply for Ugandan citizenship at independence, but they're not allowed to enter the UK because of a just blatantly racist provision of British immigration policy. What it means is that the Kenyan and Ugandan and Tanzanian governments are spending a lot of the 1960s trying to figure out ways to find loopholes to get Britain to accept larger numbers of South Asians, because they have a growing urban population who want to enter into business. And whether the economics of this make any sense or not, which they don't, but the politics of it make a lot of sense. That, okay, we're going to scapegoat lower level Indian traders politically, and actually the governments of Kenya and Uganda the ruling elites effectively form alliances with big Indian wholesale traders when they nationalize their companies. And so, there's a tragedy, I think, into the narratives that we have about the supposed failure of post-colonial politics in East Africa and the rise of racial populism, that effectively this is something that's driven by British colonial policy, and that the people who are implementing and celebrating things that appear to be exclusionary are actually striving for something that they believe or want to be more just and inclusive. The form it takes is often quite violent, but I think that as a historian, it's important for us to recover what people imagined when they were doing things that in retrospect seem very violent and anti-democratic. They were looking for a more just, inclusive, democratic society. But it was one that was foreclosed to them in many.
Yeah, so in terms of data collection, I mean, honestly, this just has a lot to do with like a lot of time. I get really worried about when I talk to students who are like jumping into kind of these topics without having have a lot of time to spend in the field before trying to investigate this stuff. So yeah, I mean, I've been working on policing in Venezuela since 2011. And so I've been able to build up a lot of networks to be able to conduct research with the police there. I think for people who know about the configuration of kind of different armed actors in countries, there are police officers from rural parts of the country where these gangs are that have family members that are friends with gang members, right? So there's this very seemingly kind of surprising route to be able to kind of connect with gang members, at least in rural parts of the country, through police officers that I was working with. This is kind of the time I happened to live in the sector in Caracas, El 23 de Enero, which is the sector that's most associated with the colectivos, which is the other armed group. And I just happened to be living there for a while with a friend of mine, which kind of opened access there. And then my co-author, Veronica, has ties with the civil society organization that operated in the area with this other gang that we're working with. So it's kind of just this confluence and collaboration of different factors of just having spent a lot of time in different places. So the project we're really focused on the period between 2013 and 2021, and we're not, other than people we've already spoken with, we might go back and talk to, we're not actively doing any more fieldwork in Venezuela right now. We are interviewing gang members that have migrated, as well as colectivo members that have migrated. So the unfortunate positive outcome of this massive migration is that we can do interviews with people outside of Venezuela in a much more secure environment. As we're continuing to collect data on that period, we can speak to people outside of the country. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would say about, there's so much to say about working on these methods, with these different groups, but I think a lot of it is just having the time to just be places to kind of figure out what's safe and what's not safe for you to be able to do. In terms of rationale for the regime, I think that this is something we're talking about, and I think it's so fascinating. I think there are a number of different factors. One, all the scholarship on criminal governance and the pluralization of armed violence is, what it's shown is that in the 20th century, from the late 20th into the 21st century, there has been a reconfiguration of what armed violence looks like in Latin America, in a lot of the global South. And Maduro is coming into that context. So he becomes president in a context where there's already a pluralization of armed actors happening, right? So he's not coming in and the state has this consolidated control over violence. So he's coming in that context. He's inherited, so something else I've worked on with colleagues is he inherited an incredibly fragmented state that was produced by Chavez before Chavez died. So it is a state capacity issue, absolutely. So there's already territories that the state doesn't control when he comes into power. There are very distrustful relationships between the government and the police for a number of different reasons. Policing in the country is very decentralized, but the government for a long period of time was very distrustful of the police and I think to a certain degree still doesn't feel like that the police is with them 100%, right? So I think, and also, so Maduro, it took him a very, very long time to really, I think, get complete buy-in by the military. So he came in this that's all to say, he came in this very, very fragile, weak position. And it took him years to get to a place where he could consolidate control over a number of key institutions. And so kind of one of the things we're thinking about is during that time period, how does a government go about maintaining some degree of stability for itself? Given that it takes a very long time for him to, we put authoritarian consolidation happening in Venezuela in 2021. So it's almost a 10-year period where he's in a very shaky. So yeah, a lot of this has to do with state capacity, kind of the state that he's inheriting, what the coercive landscape already looks like when he's coming in, and really distrustful relationships, I think, between the Maduro government and the police and the military for a while.
So I have just one question. It's for Rachel. So but first, thank you all for sharing your research. It's really great to hear about. Rachel, my question is about the sort of the broader context, because there also are domestic anti-corruption commissions and anti-corruption ombudspeople. So I was wondering was the choice to focus on this just out of interest, which is valid because of maybe you're interested in the shared governance idea? Or is there a decline in the domestic commissions so that the real stories now, the international ones, or is it you want to focus on Central America and that's what you find in Central America? And then related to that, what can thinking through the differences and similarities between the two types of commissions, how can that give you purchase for your study on the international ones?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yes, so you're absolutely right. Not only are there a lot of domestic anti-corruption agencies around the world, a lot of them are, including in some countries in Latin America, have been able to sort of prosecute these anti-corruption crusades that we see being waged by these international commissions in the Central American context. So I think that there are a couple of reasons why I look at the international ones. Part of it actually is sort of related to my deep interests and ongoing work in Central America. I admittedly, in the conclusion of my previous book, kind of have this like throwaway sentence in which I'm like, these international anti-corruption commissions are great for combating corruption where it's in political systems where it's endemic, right? And I think everything that has happened since I wrote that has sort of given me pause and made me want to sort of go back and actually interrogate what some of the lessons and the legacies are. So I think that that's one motivation. But I think a second is that there, I think, are a subset of, what I would think of as sort of weak democratic regimes with sort of a base level of bureaucratic capacity, but not enough to stand up an independent anti-corruption commission on their own, that are also extremely vulnerable to international pressures, that do recur to these kinds of international commissions. What I think is interesting is in the wake of these anti-corruption campaigns in Central America, there were calls for implementing similar commissions in Mexico, in Peru, in Haiti, in Ecuador. There was actually an attempt in Ecuador to stand up another one sponsored by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNODC, right? So it's the universe of cases for the international ones is very, very, very small, right? We can look to some examples. For example, there's a EU-backed commission in Kosovo that might be a sort of parallel, but it's more the sort of potential universe of cases as this kind of a hybrid intervention, gets broader recognition and is proposed as a solution to endemic corruption. That I think is also what's motivating me, because I think we have these experiences that are worth unpacking and learning from, right?
Thank you for sharing your projects with us today. We really look forward to the development of these projects this semester. And unfortunately, just as the room is warming up with the flood of ideas, we are running out of time. So thank you very much, and we hope we will continue this conversation.